On May 27, 1921, the body of an Osage woman was found dead in a ravine just off the north shore of the Arkansas River in northeastern Oklahoma. The autopsy found gunshot wounds to the back of the head, implying an execution. Authorities had no witnesses, no suspects, and no leads. Soon after, more and more Osage members were reported missing. Others were savagely attacked and murdered, and even young, healthy members would suddenly fall deathly ill. The local Osage people felt as if they were the targets of a well-coordinated, well-orchestrated extermination by a homicidal cabal, and the pursuant investigation uncovered perhaps the most sinister mass murder scheme the United States has ever seen. The 19th century was a period of great tribulation for the Osage people. Euro-American colonialism forced the Osage West into parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. Commingling with European settlers introduced the indigenous people to certain deadly diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and measles. But perhaps the worst of all was smallpox, which swept through the plains, decimating the Osage as well as many other tribes. By the 1870s, a majority of the Osage's massive reservation had been seized by the U.S. government, who paid the Osage a fraction of a penny per acre. The Osage took this money and purchased a large, seemingly worthless area of land in northern Oklahoma. The land was not fertile for farming, and therefore, Osage chief Watyenka assumed that it would be safe from further land poaching by white settlers. It seemed as though the sedentary tribe could finally settle down, but not before nearly 3/4 of Osage Nation had been wiped out. The turn of the century, however, would come to mark a proverbial changing of the guard. Massive oil deposits were found under the newly established Osage Reservation in Oklahoma. Initially, in the mid to late 1800s, oil exploration was very costly and very risky due to limited geological information, as it was more of a guessing game then. Not to mention, the cost of drilling equipment was outrageous, but the early 1900s brought about innovations in drilling techniques. The construction of a new pipeline to the Standard Oil Company refinery in Kansas cut transportation costs in half. This meant one thing: a surge in drilling demand. Oklahoma was widely considered the oil capital of the world, and the Burbank Field in Osage County was its golden goose. By 1920, the Burbank was producing around 25 million barrels of oil annually. And as drilling demand surges, leases are sold at a premium. Oil and gas leases were sold at public auctions held quarterly at the $1 Million Elm in Pawhuska. Oil tycoon Frank Phillips, the founder of Phillips Petroleum Company, was one of the regular lease buyers who attended. As the production increased, the prices increased, each lease seemingly outdoing the prior. One reportedly sold for just under $2 million. In all, more than 600,000 acres were auctioned off. This was all possible because the Osage Indians privately owned all of the land, including the subsurface mineral rights, by virtue of something called a Headright System, which is a federally protected right to royalties from the sale of oil. Back in the late 1800s, the government passed a piece of legislation called the Dawes Act, a bill that regulated land rights on Indian territories. It forcefully divided the Indian reservation into 160-acre quarter sections to create parallel with the rest of Oklahoma, which used a public land survey system where land was sectioned off in square miles. After the Dawes Act, the remaining unassigned lands became available to the public through the Oklahoma Land Run. Essentially, 2 million acres of America's most fertile farmland was distributed to the winners of a highly chaotic, almost comically unfair race. Many people jumped the official gun and staked their land illegally. These people were called the Sooners, and the term became so ingratiated in Oklahoma lore that they named the state school after them, and even somewhat paid tribute to them on Saturdays in the fall. Prior to these government allotments, the native tribes did not own the mineral rights, but privatizing land ownership now made mineral rights possible. However, since the government had a spotty record at best when it came to upholding treaties, the Osage were justifiably hesitant to confirm the Dawes Act, and Chief James Bigheart wisely negotiated the retention of any subsurface mineral rights for his people to share equally. And this would be ratified through the passing of the Osage Allotment Act of 1906. The U.S. Department of the Interior was then responsible for managing the mineral trust estate, including lease negotiations and distributing royalty payments, via an agency called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Each headright was entitled to a quarterly distribution of the mineral royalties. Throughout most of the 1920s, the Burbank would produce around $300 million worth of oil, resulting in extravagant royalty payments for the owners of these headrights. The average-sized Osage family of 5 received around $65,000 a year, which equates to approximately $1.2 million today. They indulged in the finest wines and wore expensive jewelry and were even chauffeured around by white people in brand-new Rolls Royces. The Osage had become the richest people in the world per capita. It seemed that all of their troubles were now behind them. However, word of the extravagant wealth got around, and some outsiders saw an opportunity. About this time, a young man named Ernest Burkhart decided to leave his home in Texas to try to find work on the oil fields and start a new life in Osage County. He met up with his uncle, William Hale, a local resident of Gray Horse, Oklahoma, who had amassed a sizable fortune by virtue of various apparently successful business ventures, including his cattle ranching. However, Ernest soon learned that his uncle was involved in so much more. William King Hale, who coined himself the King of the Osage Hills, was an ambitious man who wanted power and knew that money was the key. After years of cattle ranching and purchasing grazing leases on the Osage land, Hale's focus shifted to beneath the surface. Hale learned about the unique Osage Headright System, which established 2,229 full headrights. Every full-blooded Osage was worth 657 net mineral acres, more than a standard section of land, which means that
money flows freely here now.
Hale considered the possibility of purchasing these rights, but this was prohibited, as Osage headrights could not be bought or sold. They were in fact only transferable on death via probate. However, one does not have to be of Osage blood to own a headright, just a legal heir of someone who does. William Hale had established a relationship with the Osage people over the years, and he had even learned to speak the Osage language. Hale persuaded his fresh-on-the-scene nephew to befriend a local woman named Molly Kyle, a full-blood Osage who just so happened to own a full headright. In 1917, Ernest and Molly would marry, setting in motion a decade of hell known commonly as the Reign of Terror.
You can run on for a long time, run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Sooner or later, God'll cut you down. Sooner or later, God'll cut you down.
Just 1 year after marrying Ernest, Molly's youngest sister, Minnie Smith, would mysteriously die of something called wasting illness, although she was by all means in good health. Then, on May 14th, Charles Whitehorn, a friend and full-blood Osage man, went missing. Just a week later, Anna Brown, being another sister of Molly, went missing after accepting a ride home from Ernest Burkhart's brother, Brian. Her body would turn up in a ravine just north of Fairfax, with a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Less than 2 months after burying Anna, Molly Burkhart would have to make funeral arrangements for her mother, who suddenly fell ill and died in July, seemingly succumbing to the same illness that killed Molly's sister just 3 years prior. In February the following year, William Stepson, a full-blood Osage, died from poisoning, being the first of a string of more Osage deaths by the same fate. The Osage people knew they were being systematically targeted and eliminated. Local law enforcement was not helpful. They knew that they needed outside help, so the Osage reached out to wealthy oil magnate and trusted friend, Barney McBride. He offered to go to Washington to plead for the U.S. government to look into the strange events. The day after his arrival, McBride was brutally stabbed to death. In January of 1923, the bodies of Joe Grayhorse and Anna Sanford, also Osage headright owners, were found murdered. The next month, Henry Roan, a full-blooded Osage and cousin of Molly Burkhart, was found shot dead, execution style, near the same place Anna Brown's body was discovered. Just 1 month later, on March 10, 1923, the home of Bill Smith mysteriously exploded, immediately killing his wife Rita and their servant girl Nettie Brookshire. Bill would die in the hospital a few days later. Rita Smith happened to be the third sister of Molly Burkhart. Unfortunately, Molly Burkhart was set to inherit another Headright, being her fourth in the last 5 years, which meant that her husband and William Hale's nephew Ernest was now legal heir to a full 5 Osage Headright allotments. Further investigation into the Smith home explosion found a 5-gallon drum of nitroglycerin underneath the rubble, deliberately ignited, meaning the Smith home was a targeted bombing. On his deathbed, Bill Smith is reported to say that he had no enemies, except William Hale. This finally prompted Washington to get involved. J. Edgar Hoover sent his newly created Bureau of Investigation, now known as the FBI, to Oklahoma, appointing Special Agent Tom White as lead investigator. White was a former Texas Ranger and giant walking stereotype, from his 6-shooter to his boots to his 10-gallon cowboy hat. But he was savvy and extremely methodical. It didn't take long for Agent White to figure out why all the prior local investigations into the matters had stalled out. There was obvious corruption at every level, from lawyers to police officers to judges. Intimidation doesn't even begin to describe what was being done to the locals. People would refuse to talk in fear for their lives. Nearly every member of the Osage tribe knew someone who had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. When people would come forward with information, it was often wrong or misleading, as if the person giving the information was trying to thwart the investigation. White knew that there was only one way to navigate the investigation. He would employ 4 undercover agents with no connections to any person within Osage County. They would carefully interact with the townspeople as to gain their trust and hopefully obtain useful information. This was tedious but effective. The status reports of the agents continued to turn up the same 2 names over and over: William Hale and Ernest Burkhart. In a suspicious turn of events, Agent White uncovered a life insurance policy Hale recently cashed in for $25,000. Hale was the beneficiary, and the insured was Henry Roan, the murdered cousin of Molly Burkhart. This was the starting point, and soon White began to connect the dots. Hale's nephew marries Molly, and within 5 years, her entire family is dead under seemingly unusual circumstances. And now, Molly was battling what seemed to be the same illness that took her sister and mother. She began to suspect Ernest was poisoning her, so she packed up and left on the advice of her priest. If Molly did not get better, Ernest was going to inherit a fortune, and Hale was presumably going to get a hefty share. Proving this scheme was going to be tough with nothing but presumptions and circumstantial evidence. Instead, Agent White decided to pursue a different avenue. In his interactions with Ernest, White noticed a vulnerability. The man lacked the conviction and stubbornness his uncle had, and White was going to exploit it. One of White's informants had confronted him with information regarding the bombing of Bill and Rita Smith's house. He had the name of the explosives expert who built the bomb, as well as the name of a middleman. Only one problem: they were both mysteriously killed in 1923, about 1 week apart. With Burkhart and Hale being the obvious culprits, it was time for Agent White to dig his spurs into Ernest and start to apply pressure. Until finally, Ernest broke. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe he was just tired of the lies. Regardless, Burkhart confessed to orchestrating the bombing of Bill and Rita's home. Further, he would implicate his uncle as the mastermind, while turning state's evidence. John Ramsey, an associate of Hale, would eventually confess to murdering Henry Roan on Hale's orders. Ernest Burkhart, John Ramsey, and William K. Hale would be tried in federal court in Guthrie, Oklahoma, the original state capital. The trials were long and spanned a couple of years, but convictions were made, and all 3 would be given life sentences, officially putting an end to the king of the Osage's reign of terror.
You can run on for a long time, run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down.